The night the palace burned began with a distant tremor that felt like the sky itself was holding its breath. And a lone human soldier named Arlen sprinted through the collapsing halls with smoke clawing at his lungs, and sparks falling like dying stars around him. He had been ordered to retreat minutes ago, but something in him refused to leave. Some instinct whispering that someone was still alive in the ruins even though every sensor read the place as lost. A soft cry cut through the fire, thin as glass but sharp enough to freeze him in place. Arlen turned toward the shattered throne chamber where blue flames licked the walls and cracked crystals glowed with fading royal power. And there on the ground lay a girl with silver skin and glowing golden eyes blinking weakly through the smoke. She wasn't human. That much was clear. But the fear in her eyes was the same fear he had seen on battlefields across 100 worlds, the kind that begged not for mercy but for hope. He reached her just as another blast shook the palace, and the ceiling split open like a wounded beast. Raining down stone and fire, she tried to speak but only managed to tremble. Her hand rising to her chest where a strange symbol pulsed beneath her skin like a heartbeat made of light. When Arlen touched her, the symbol brightened as if it recognized him, sending a warm shock through his arm that made his breath hitch. There was no time to question it. He lifted her gently, surprised by how light she felt, as if her bones were made of starlight instead of matter, and he ran back through the burning corridors while the building crumbled behind him, step by terrifying step. Every shadow felt like a threat, every sound a warning, and the air screamed with the roar of the invading warlord's army as they tore their way deeper into the royal city. Outside, the palace courtyard was a battlefield of fire and metal. Human rescue craft hovering low under heavy enemy fire, their beams cutting through smoke to find survivors. Arlen sprinted toward the nearest dropship as its engines roared, carrying the alien girl in his arms as if she were the last living spark of the dying palace. Blaster shots cracked past him, carving molten trails in the stone, and a missile strike threw him off balance, sending him crashing to his knees, but he never let go of her, not even for a breath when he reached the ship. Medics pulled her from his arms, their eyes wide with confusion at her shimmering skin and flickering symbol. Arlen followed, refusing to step back even when officers shouted protocols and warnings, because something in him knew the moment he saw her that leaving wasn't an option anymore. Inside the medbay, the ship shook violently as it blasted into the upper atmosphere, and lights flickered while alarms screamed in red pulses. The girl lay on the bed, her breathing thin and unstable, and the med droids ran scans that made no sense to human science. Her gene structure was layered and shifting, like she was one person wearing the memory of another. Her heart rate crashed, and the machines wailed with rising urgency. Arlen didn't think. He just acted. He stepped forward as the medic shouted that she needed immediate stabilizing energy, something close to her resonance, something living, something connected. Her hand reached out blindly, trembling, and Arlen took it without hesitation. A sudden surge of warmth rippled between them, a chain of light rising along her symbol and echoing faintly in his veins. Her lungs expanded, her eyes flickered open, and for a brief moment she looked at him as if she had known him long before that burning night. When she spoke, her voice was soft and unsteady. Why would a human save a clone of the Queen?" she whispered, each word trembling like a fragile star on the edge of collapse. The room froze, the medics exchanged stunned glances, and Arlen felt the air thin around him as the weight of her words settled deep in his chest. Clone of the Queen, not just any queen, but the ruler of the Seraph Dominion, one of the most powerful alien empires in the known galaxy, and he had carried her clone out of a burning palace and into a human ship under enemy fire. The clone, she called herself Lisa, held his hand a moment longer, her eyes shimmering with something that looked like gratitude and fear woven together. "You touched my blood with yours," she whispered. "You saved me." "That creates a bond we cannot break." Arlen didn't understand the meaning behind her words, but he felt their weight in his bones, a quiet gravity pulling their fates closer than any human law or alien decree could explain. Before he could speak, the medbay lights dimmed into an eerie purple glow, and Lisa's symbol blazed like a beacon, sending a thin beam of light into the ceiling. A shipwide alarm sounded, not for danger, but for recognition. A royal signal had just been activated, a message that only one being in the universe could receive. The real queen, and she now knew exactly where her clone was, and exactly which human had touched her, carried her, and bonded with her. The hull shook as something vast dropped out of slipspace nearby, and the ship's AI voice filled the corridors in a trembling metallic whisper. "Unidentified royal dreadnought has arrived. Transmitting urgent decree. Human soldier Arlen Reyes is ordered to surrender at once. By command of the Queen herself, Arlen felt Lisa's fingers tighten around his, her eyes glowing with fear and a strange fragile hope. The world outside burned, the Queen approached, and destiny had just stepped onto the battlefield with them. And nothing about their lives would ever be the same again. The royal dreadnought hovered outside the human patrol ship, like a silent moon carved from silver and shadow. Its presence so massive that even the air inside the corridors felt heavier, as if the Queen's gaze pressed against every wall, every heartbeat, every breath Arlen took. The crew whispered in fear. Officers ran from console to console trying to keep their voices steady, and the ship's pale lights flickered with the pressure of the incoming royal transmission. Arlen stood beside Lysa in the medbay, her hand still resting weakly in his, and the strange symbol on her chest glowing like a heartbeat that wasn't fully her own. The comms screen bloomed to life with a pulse of cold blue light, and a holographic envoy stepped forward, tall and armored in living crystal that wrapped him like a second skin, his voice sharp and ceremonial. By decree of Her Celestial Majesty, Queen Seraphine of the Seraph Dominion, the envoy said, his gaze cutting straight to Arlen. The human known as Arlen Reyes is ordered to surrender for immediate evaluation, by law of the bonded echo recorded between him and the Queen's sanctioned clone. Every word felt like a chain tightening around Arlen's body. But what bothered him wasn't fear of surrender. It was the way the envoy spoke of Lysa like she wasn't a person. Only an echo, a tool, a royal extension. Lisa tried to sit up, her breath shaky, her voice trembling as she whispered, "I am not an echo. I'm alive. I am me." But the envoy ignored her completely, his eyes fixed on Arlen with a cold that felt older than kingdoms. Arlen stepped closer to Lisa, shielding her without thinking, and a quiet anger tightened his jaw, the kind that came from seeing too many people treated like they were less than human, less than worthy of choice. "I'm not going anywhere until she's safe," Arlen said softly. But the words carried steel. The envoy tilted his head as if studying an insect that dared speak. "Safety is irrelevant," he replied. "Law supersedes life when royal blood is involved." The entire medbay went silent, and even the hum of the engines felt like it held its breath. Arlen felt something cold and electric crawl up his spine, something old inside him that refused to bow. He took one slow step forward, meeting the envoy's gaze with a steady calm that rattled the alien officer more than any weapon could. "With humans," Arlen said quietly, "life comes first." The envoy's armor pulsed in irritation, and he reached out not for a weapon but for Lisa. As if claiming property, Arlen reacted faster than thought, snatching the envoy's wrist with a force that made the crystal plating crack like thin ice. The entire medbay gasped as a shard fell to the floor. Glowing faintly before turning dull, Lisa's eyes widened. Fear and astonishment blending in her golden glow, she whispered, "Arlen, you touched royal armor with bare hands. That's a violation punishable by—" "Let them try," Arlen whispered back, still gripping the envoy's arm as he gently pushed him away from Lysa. The envoy recovered, anger flickering in the crystal veins along his armor. "Very well," he hissed. "The Queen will address this herself." The hologram shifted, the blue light deepening into a luminous gold, and the temperature in the medbay dropped as a new presence stepped into the projection. Queen Seraphine appeared, tall, impossibly graceful, her form shimmering like a star reflected in dark water, her eyes glowing with a power that made the air pulse. She studied Arlen first, and for a heartbeat the room felt too small to contain her gaze. Then her eyes shifted to Lisa, and something complicated, almost painful, flickered across the Queen's expression. Not anger, not disdain, but something that looked strangely like regret. "Lisa," the Queen said softly, and her voice carried centuries of weight and sorrow. "You were not created to suffer." Lysa flinched as if the words were both comfort and wound. "I want to live," she whispered. "I want to choose my path." The Queen's gaze hardened like a blade drawn in silence. "Your path is mine," she replied. "You are my reflection. And my responsibility." Arlen stepped forward, every instinct screaming that this was wrong, that no living being deserved to be treated like a shadow. "With respect, Your Majesty," he said, knowing every word could cost him his life. "She is not your reflection. She is a person." Golden light flared in the Queen's eyes, not in anger but in surprise, like she hadn't expected a human to challenge her personally. "You risk war," she warned. "Your defiance breaks interstellar law." Arlen held her gaze. Calm, steady, I'm not defying your empire, he said quietly. I'm protecting someone who asked me for help. The Queen studied him again. Longer this time. Slower, as if searching for something she couldn't quite name. Finally, she lifted one elegant hand and a burst of gold filled the room. Her voice echoed like distant thunder, soft but inescapable. Then by ancient right, I invoke the trial of accord. The medbay lights flickered. The ship's AI trembled and Lisa gasped as the symbol on her chest pulsed painfully. The Queen's voice wrapped around them like unseen chains. You, the clone, and the human who bonded with you will come to royal space under enforced ceasefire, she declared. And there we will decide the fate of all three. Her eyes narrowed slightly, her voice quieting into something almost human. Refuse, and the Dominion will consider humanity in violation of royal sovereignty. The hologram vanished. The dreadnought outside shifted position like a predator waiting for movement. Lisa grabbed Arlen's hand with trembling fingers. Arlen, you don't have to do this, she whispered, fear shaking through every syllable. He looked at her golden eyes, her fragile hope, her terror of being dragged back into a life not her own. And he felt destiny settle into his bones like a storm preparing to break. Yes, he said gently, I do, because some battles weren't about empires or laws, but about the quiet promise made in a burning palace when he carried her through falling fire. And Arlen Reyes had never broken a promise. Not on Earth, not in space, not even under the gaze of a queen. The royal shuttle glided through the shimmering gates of Aurelia Prime like a silver tear slipping into a dream, and Arlen felt every muscle in his body tighten as the alien world unfolded beneath them. A city of glass towers and glowing bridges suspended over drifting fields of living light. It was beautiful, breathtaking, and terrifying all at once. The kind of place that made a human feel both honored and unwelcome in the same breath. Beside him, Lisa sat quietly, her golden eyes reflecting the lights below as if she were watching a future she wasn't sure she deserved. The Queen's escort ship circled them like a crown of blades, their movements fluid and deadly. And the air inside the shuttle hummed with a soft pressure that told Arlen the Queen was already watching them. Even before they landed, he glanced at Lisa, noticing how she held her hands close to her chest, as if protecting the flickering symbol that bound her fate to a throne she never asked for. You don't have to be afraid, he whispered, even though he knew fear was the only reasonable thing in a place like this. Lisa gave a faint smile, fragile but brave. I'm not afraid of the Queen, she murmured. I'm afraid of what she sees when she looks at me. A reflection she didn't choose. The shuttle touched down in a breath of white dust, and the ramp lowered to reveal a path of crystal that pulsed softly under their feet, lighting up with every step as if the planet itself was reading their presence. Royal guards stood in formation, their armor alive with shifting colors, their eyes following Arlen with a cold curiosity. Humans were rare here, and a human who had bonded with royal blood was unheard of. Impossible. A myth walking on foreign ground. At the end of the path stood Queen Seraphine. She didn't wear a crown because she didn't need one. Her presence alone was enough to bend the air around her. Tall, luminous, her skin shimmering with constellations that seemed to move gently like tides under her skin. She radiated a calm so deep it felt dangerous. Her gaze settled first on Arlen, piercing through him with quiet intensity. Then her eyes moved to Lisa, and something inside that golden gaze softened, cracked, reformed, as if she were standing before a memory she once created but never truly understood. Lisa, the Queen said, her voice soft enough to make the guards straighten as if struck by lightning. You survived. Lisa bowed her head, not in obedience but in sorrow. I survived because someone chose me, she said gently, glancing toward Arlen. Not because I was made for a purpose. The Queen's expression tightened, the smallest fracture in her calm. Purpose defines survival, she replied. Without purpose, life is chaos. Arlen stepped forward before Lisa could answer, the heat of injustice rising in him like a storm. With respect, Your Majesty, he said, his voice steady despite the weight around him. Life defines purpose, not the other way around. The guards shifted, shocked by the human's boldness, but the Queen raised a hand, silencing them with a single flick of her fingers. She studied Arlen as if evaluating something rare, something dangerous, something she had never prepared for. You speak boldly for a soldier, she said, but there was no mockery in her tone. Only observation. Tell me, Arlen of Earth. Do you understand what your bond with Lisa means? Arlen hesitated. Not because he feared the truth, but because he didn't yet know the shape of it. I know I won't abandon her, he said. Not to fear, not to law, not to fate. A ripple went through the court. A soundless gasp carried on shifting lights. The queen walked toward him slowly, each step graceful enough to make the floor glow. And when she stood before Arlen, their heights nearly equal, the world seemed to fall silent. Then let us test your words, she said quietly. In the court of mirrors, she gestured, and the floor beneath them shifted, turning into a platform that rose into the upper chambers of the palace. As the light changed, Arlen felt the air thicken with ancient energy, and Lisa gripped his hand tightly, her breath trembling as the chamber revealed itself. Mirrors, but not ordinary ones. These mirrors didn't show their reflections. They showed possibilities, futures, pasts, choices made and unmade. The queen stepped into the circle of mirrors, her voice resonating softly. Here we see truth, she murmured. But truth is not always kind. Images flickered around them, showing Lisa being created in a chamber of light, surrounded by silent architects who shaped her from royal DNA. Arlen saw her take her first step, her first word, her first moment of loneliness as she stared at her own reflection, unsure if she was meant to live or simply exist. Lisa watched the moments unfold with quiet pain. I am more than this, she whispered. I have learned to feel, to choose, to hope. Then the mirrors shifted to Arlen, showing him in battles on scorched worlds, saving strangers, carrying wounded men who cursed him for trying, fighting not because he loved war but because he hated the silence of failure. The queen observed him, and something like respect flickered behind her gaze. You protect instinctively, she said. Even when logic says you should run, Arlen nodded. Because someone has to, he answered. And I won't apologize for it. The queen turned to Lisa, her voice softer now. And you? What do you want, my mirror? Lisa looked at her own image, then at Arlen, then back at the queen. I want to live without being claimed, she whispered. I want to choose my own destiny, not walk in the shadow of yours. For the first time, the queen's composure fractured completely, a single tremor running through her voice. You were not made to stand alone, she said, almost pleading. You were made because I needed to understand what I could never risk. The chamber dimmed, and before Arlen could react, a sharp pulse of violet light tore through the room. Followed by a thunderous crash, guards shouted, alarms erupted, and the mirrors shattered into shards of burning light. An assassin materialized from the smoke, blade drawn, racing straight toward the queen. Arlen moved without thinking, diving between the attacker and Seraphine, catching the strike with his forearm as pain exploded through him. The blade flickered with venomous energy, slicing deep, but Arlen held firm, refusing to fall, refusing to let the queen die in her own court. Guards tackled the assassin. The chamber raged with chaotic light, and Lisa screamed his name. Arlen staggered, clutching his bleeding arm, and the queen stared at him with wide eyes full of shock and something deeper, something like recognition, something like fate twisting into a new shape. For the first time since their arrival, Queen Seraphine whispered, not as a ruler but as a woman shaken to her core. You protected me. Why? Arlen breathed through the pain, his voice rough but steady. Because protecting people is what I do, he said. Queen or clone, it doesn't matter. The queen stared at him as if the universe had just changed direction, and in that moment, something dangerous and beautiful began to form between them. Something that would decide the fate of all three, and the fate of empires beyond. The alarms of Aurelia Prime echoed through the palace like a heartbeat turning into a scream, each pulse shaking the crystal walls while the sky outside darkened under the shadow of an approaching fleet. Arlen stood with his injured arm bandaged tightly, the sting of the assassin's blade still burning through his nerves, but his eyes were locked on the massive windows where shapes emerged from warp-like monsters rising from deep water, ships of iron and bone, marked with the cruel emblem of Warlord Karox, a sworn enemy of the Seraph Dominion. Moved into formation with slow, predatory hunger. Lisa pressed closer to Arlen, her breathing sharp with fear, and the queen stepped toward the balcony with a tension in her. Steps that made the entire court fall silent. Queen Seraphine looked at the sky as if it were a wound opening in the fabric of her world, her golden eyes narrowing with a calm that came from centuries of carrying an empire on her shoulders. Karox did not come for war, she whispered. He came for the child. Those words struck the room like lightning, and Arlen felt cold dread slide down his spine. Lisa's hand moved instinctively to her stomach, even though she wasn't yet showing, as if trying to shield the life growing inside her from a threat across the stars. "I won't let him take me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I won't let him take our child." Arlen turned to her, his voice steady despite the chaos outside. "He'll have to go through me first," he said softly, and she leaned into him as if his words alone could steady the trembling world beneath her feet. The Queen watched them with an expression Arlen couldn't read, a mix of sorrow, admiration, and something deeper, something she wasn't ready to name. Then she lifted her chin, her voice echoing through the chamber with the strength of a ruler who refused to let fear decide the fate of her people. "Prepare the capital shields," she commanded. "Summon every wing, every knight, every pulse-bearer. Kyrox will not take what is mine." A thunderous sound rolled across the sky as the Seraph defense wings launched from hidden hangars, streaks of blue and gold rising into the chaos, meeting Kyrox's invading fleet with violent bursts of light. Arlen watched the battle begin, the sky swirling with fire and debris, and a fierce determination rose in him like a storm waking from sleep. He wasn't born into alien politics or royal bloodlines, but he knew battles, he knew danger, and he knew how to lead when he turned to speak. Seraphine was already facing him. "I need you in the air," she said quietly, her tone leaving no room for refusal. "Your human instincts are unpredictable, and unpredictable is exactly what we need against him." Her gaze slid briefly to his wounded arm, then to Lisa, and something flickered in her expression again. "But do not die," she added in a softer voice. "Not today." Arlen nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle into his chest. "I'll come back," he promised, and for a moment, neither Seraphine nor Lisa doubted him. Even though the sky outside promised the opposite, minutes later, Arlen sprinted through the hangar as technicians rushed to prepare a hybrid strike craft built from human controls and Seraph energy cores. It hummed with unstable power, something between a fighter jet and a living creature, its wings folding and unfolding like breathing metal. "You fly it with your mind as much as your hands," the engineer warned. But Arlen was already climbing into the cockpit, adrenaline tightening every muscle in his body. As the canopy sealed, Arlen caught sight of Lisa at the hangar edge, her hands clasped to her chest, her eyes shimmering like molten gold. She didn't speak, and she didn't need to, and her fear, her hope, her love were written across her face in a way that made Arlen's heartbeat feel too loud in his chest. He raised one hand to the glass and she mirrored the gesture, a silent promise passing between them, a promise to return, a promise to survive, a promise to protect. The craft shot out of the hangar like a silver spear, and the battlefield opened around him in a storm of blazing weapons and twisting debris. Kyrox's warships unleashed dark crimson beams that tore through Seraph formations, ripping apart wings with brutal precision. Arlen's instincts took over, weaving between fire trails, dodging explosions by inches, pushing the craft harder than it had ever been pushed. Every movement felt like a dance with death, but he moved with calm focus. A soldier who had survived dozens of impossible battles and refused to lose this one. His calm lit up with Seraphine's voice, steady even under fire. "Arlen, he is here." A chill ran through him as a massive warship emerged from the smoke, its hull shaped like a monstrous jaw, its energy coils glowing with blood-red light. Kyrox's flagship, the beast at the center of the storm. The ship unleashed a volley aimed not at fighters but at the capital below. Straight toward the palace, straight toward Lisa. Arlen didn't think, he acted, diving into the path of the beam with the speed of a falling star, firing every weapon his craft held, his body moving faster than fear. The collision of energies rocked the sky, a blinding burst that turned night into white fire, and Arlen felt the shockwave slam into him, sending his craft spiraling like a wounded bird. The world tilted, alarm screamed, metal groaned, and for a moment he couldn't see, couldn't breathe, couldn't tell if he was still alive. But through the static, through the burning heat, through the flood of pain, he heard one voice cut through the chaos, Lisa's voice trembling but alive. "Arlen, please, come back to me." He forced the craft to stabilize, smoke trailing behind him like a comet's tail, his breath ragged but unbroken. "I'm not done yet," he whispered, and the fire in his eyes burned brighter than the war around him. But as he rose back into the battle, a sudden, chilling signal echoed through every channel, a message from Kyrox himself, broadcast to the entire world, his voice dripping with cruel triumph. "I have your precious clone," he declared, "and the unborn heir. Abdicate by dawn or watch them die." Arlen froze, the sky spinning around him. Lisa, captured, taken from under their protection. Taken from him, his heart became a storm, a violent, unstoppable force, and in that moment, The war above Aurelia Prime stopped being about empires or thrones. It became personal. It became a rescue. It became a promise he would keep with blood if he had to. Arlen Reyes would get her back or he would burn the stars trying. The Veil Nebula rose before them like a living storm made of violet fire and drifting shadows. A place where light seemed to breathe and darkness twisted into shapes that whispered warnings no human language could carry. Arlen stood at the edge of the Queen's stealth cutter. His hands clenched around the rail as the ship slipped into the glowing fog, every pulse of the engine sounding like a fragile heartbeat. Lysa was somewhere inside this storm, held by Kerox in a fortress hidden deep within the nebula's electric clouds, and every second she remained there made Arlen's chest feel tighter, as if the universe itself were squeezing the air out of him. Queen Seraphine stood beside him, silent but steady, her presence calm while the nebula swirled around them like a world breaking apart. Her eyes reflected the storm outside, but something else lived behind them tonight, something quieter than duty and heavier than power. Arlen could feel it in the way she watched the path ahead, her expression guarded, her shoulders holding a weight she never showed in her throne room. "You don't fear this place," Arlen said softly, even though every instinct in him screamed that the veil was wrong. Alive, watching. The Queen's voice answered in a whisper that felt almost human. "I fear what I must face inside it." Arlen turned toward her, his voice rough with sincerity. "You mean Kerox?" But Seraphine shook her head slowly, her gaze deep and unsteady. "No, I mean myself." Silence filled the small deck, broken only by the hum of the ship pushing deeper into the glowing chaos. Arlen waited, sensing she needed to speak but had never allowed herself the freedom. At last she exhaled, her words soft but sharp with truth. "I created Lysa," she murmured, "because I wanted to know if I could ever be loved for more than my crown." The confession stunned Arlen, hitting him with a weight he wasn't prepared for. Seraphine's golden gaze dropped to the floor. "I wanted to feel what a queen is not allowed to feel. Tenderness, closeness, hope." Her voice trembled, the slightest crack in centuries of imperial strength. "But I was too afraid to risk my empire for something so fragile. So I made her." She closed her eyes, pain rolling through her like a shadow. "And now she suffers for the cowardice I hid behind duty." Arlen stepped closer, the glow of the nebula lighting the sharp lines of his face. "You didn't make her to suffer," he said gently. "You made her because you were lonely." Seraphine flinched, not from the honesty but from how true it felt. "Loneliness is a dangerous seed," she whispered. "It grows into choices that haunt us." Before Arlen could respond, the ship jolted as ion ghosts slammed into the hull, streaks of crackling light sliding across the shields like the claws of unseen creatures. Alarms flickered, the engines groaning as the nebula tightened its grip. The pilot called back to them with strained urgency. "Storm wall ahead. If we push through it, we won't have another chance to turn back." Arlen looked at Seraphine, a wordless agreement passing between them. "We go," she commanded, her voice steady again. "For Lysa," Arlen added, and the Queen nodded, her expression softening for a heartbeat. They plunged into the storm wall, lightning tearing across the sky in spirals that felt almost sentient. Arlen held his breath as the shields flickered dangerously. The ship shook so violently he had to brace himself, his heart pounding like a drum caught in a storm. When they finally broke through, the sight ahead stole the breath from his lungs. Kerox's spire floated in the heart of the nebula, a tower of black stone and red energy veins, suspended above a swirling pit of electric storms that looked ready to devour anything weaker than hatred. It pulsed like a heartbeat made of rage, echoing through the void with dread that chilled the soul. The stealth cutter latched onto the tower's underside with magnetic anchors, and Arlen and Seraphine dropped into the fortress through a side breach carved by Kerox's own weapons inside. Shadows moved across the walls like living creatures watching them from the corners. The air smelled of metal, fear and old battles. Arlen's pulse raced, every sense sharp, every step heavier. Seraphine's aura glowed softly, lighting their path with pale gold, her power reacting to the dark energy around them. They reached the inner chambers, where a cell glowed faintly in the distance like a dying star. Lysa lay inside, weak but alive, her symbol flickering unevenly, her eyelids fluttering as if she fought to stay conscious. When she lifted her gaze and saw Arlen, tears filled her eyes with painful relief. "You came," she whispered, her voice barely there. "You really came." Arlen rushed to the barrier, his hand pressing to the shimmering field that kept her trapped. "I said I would," he whispered, his heart breaking at the sight of her pain. "I said I'd find you." Seraphine knelt beside her, her voice trembling with regret. "I'm sorry," she breathed. "You should never have been dragged into my sins," Lysa smiled weakly. "You didn't create me wrong. You just never let yourself believe I could live." The moment hung between them, fragile and full of truth. Arlen looked at the queen, seeing her not as a ruler but as someone finally facing the ghost she had created. But the air changed suddenly, the floor rumbling beneath their feet, alarms wailing through the spire like the cry of a dying beast. Karox's voice boomed over the chamber speakers, dripping with mockery. "If you want the clone, then die with her." A reactor overload warning flashed across the walls, red light bathing everything in dread. Seraphine's eyes widened. "He's going to collapse the tower." Arlen turned sharply, scanning the controls. "There must be a manual vent." Seraphine looked at him with sudden fear. "It's on the lower core. Only one person can reach it in time." Arlen didn't hesitate, sharing one look with Lysa, a look that held love, fear, and a promise not yet fulfilled. "Take her and run," he said. Moving toward the lower deck, Seraphine grabbed his arm, her voice breaking for the first time. "Arlen, don't..." He gave her a small, soft smile. "Some things are worth the risk." The alarms screamed louder, the tower shaking as energy built toward a deadly burst. And Arlen Reyes ran into the storming core, ready to face death itself. If it meant saving the two lives bound to his heart, one by fate and one by choice. The lower core felt like the heart of a dying beast, every metal beam trembling under the pressure of the overload, every light flickering in frantic pulses as if warning Arlen to turn back while he still had breath left to save. Heat slammed into him the moment he entered the chamber, waves of scorching air rolling off the rising energy coils, turning his skin damp and his lungs heavy. But he kept moving, each step driven by one thought, one promise, one name beating in his chest like a war drum: Lysa. Sparks rained from the ceiling as the reactor roared, blue fire curling around exposed conduits like serpents of lightning, twisting through the dark, and Arlen sprinted toward the manual vent wheel at the far end of the room, its metal glowing faintly red under the building pressure. The whole spire shook violently, and a deep roar echoed through the walls as if the nebula itself felt the tower preparing to tear apart. Arlen tightened his grip and pulled, the wheel refusing to move, the heat burning through his palms as pain bit deep into his muscles. He gritted his teeth and pulled again, every bone in his arm screaming, every heartbeat thundering in his ears. Suddenly footsteps sounded behind him, quick and sharp, and he turned with a gasp as Queen Seraphine rushed into the core, her hair whipping in the burning air, her aura flickering wildly under the violent storm of energy. "You're supposed to be gone," Arlen rasped, choking on the rising heat. Seraphine didn't answer with words at first. She simply stepped beside him and placed her hands on the wheel, the golden glow of her power pushing against the resisting metal as she met his gaze with eyes full of fierce determination. "I told you not to die today," she whispered, her voice trembling from heat and something deeper. "I meant it." Together they pushed, metal grinding painfully, the wheel turning inch by inch as the roar of the reactor grew louder. The core lit up with brilliant arcs of blue fire, each one close enough to scorch Arlen's skin. Yet Seraphine stood her ground, her expression carved with resolve strong enough to challenge death itself. "You should have left," Arlen shouted over the storm. Seraphine shook her head, her voice steady even as sweat streaked down her skin. "A queen does not run from the people she loves." The word hit Arlen harder than the heat around him. Loves, not commands, not controls, not rules. Loves. He stared at her, stunned, but before he could speak, a massive surge of energy erupted behind them, throwing both of them against the wall, lightning tearing across the chamber with furious teeth. Arlen coughed hard, pushing himself up, vision spinning. Limbs screaming in protest, Seraphine stumbled beside him, gripping the railing as her breath trembled out of her chest in painful waves. But when their eyes met, something unspoken passed between them. An understanding. A truth. A connection growing in the fire. "We finished this," Arlen said. Forcing himself back to the wheel, Seraphine nodded, following him with a soft, pained smile. Together, their hands met the metal once more, pushing with every last shred of strength left in their bodies, and with a violent groan the wheel finally gave, spinning into place as the overload pressure released in a burst of blinding white light. The core quieted, the storm settling into a low hum, the danger fading like a dying scream swallowed in the dark. Arlen sank to his knees, his body shaking with exhaustion and relief, the heat slowly lifting. The air cooling as the reactor stabilized. Seraphine knelt beside him, brushing soot from his face with hands trembling. Not from weakness, but from emotion she had buried for too long. "You saved us," she whispered, her voice barely holding together. Arlen shook his head weakly. "No. We saved each other." For a moment, the chaos outside felt far away. The nebula silent, the war distant, the world shrinking to just the two of them in the quiet after the storm. Seraphine's eyes softened, their golden glow dimming into something warm and fragile. "There is something you must understand," she murmured when I said the words. "That I wanted a turn. It wasn't the claim of a queen, Arlen. It was the wish of a lonely woman afraid of her own heart." Arlen's breath caught, the weight of her confession sinking into him like a truth he had sensed but never dared to name. He reached for her hand, their fingers touching lightly in the fading heat. "You don't have to be afraid of wanting something real," he said gently. "Not with me." Her lips parted as if to answer, but a sudden cry echoed through the calm. Lysa's voice trembling with pain and urgency. "Seraphine." "Arlen, something's wrong." The child, Seraphine's face drained of color, her heart twisting in her eyes. "We have to get back," she breathed. Rising to her feet with renewed strength, Arlen forced himself up, ignoring the screaming pain in his muscles as he leaned heavily against the railing for balance. "Move," he said. "Don't stop." "I'm right behind you." They raced through the corridors as the spire rumbled again, flashing lights painting their path in sharp bursts of red. When they reached the upper chamber, they found Lisa clutching her stomach, breath trembling, sweat beading on her brow, her golden eyes shining with fear and pain. Arlen rushed forward, catching her before she fell. "Lysa!" "I'm here," he whispered, holding her close. She gripped his shirt tightly, her voice breaking. "The child." "Something is happening. Too fast." Seraphine knelt on her other side, her hands glowing softly as she scanned Lysa with trembling urgency, her face turning pale as she whispered, "It's not just the child. The nebula energy is accelerating everything." Before anyone could react, the tower shook violently, sparks raining down from above as a new alarm screamed through the chamber. A fleet had just arrived on the outer rim of the nebula, Karox's backup forces, massive, merciless, and closing in like a storm of death. Arlen held Lisa tightly as Seraphine rose, her eyes blazing with fierce determination. "The final battle is coming," she said, her voice steady and strong. "And your child, our future, will not be born into fear." Arlen lifted Lisa in his arms as the world shook around them. The queen turned toward the storm outside with fire in her gaze, and the three of them walked together toward the coming war, bound now not by law or blood or destiny, but by choice, by love, and by a future they would fight to protect with everything they had left. The nebula storm opened like a wounded sky as the final battle began, lightning spilling across the dark void while warships clashed in blinding bursts of blue and red, their engines screaming through the growing chaos. Arlen stood at the center of the Queen's command deck, his body still aching from the core chamber, but his focus locked like iron on the battle outside, every explosion reflecting in his eyes as he tried to stay calm for one reason alone. Lysa behind him, the door slid open and Seraphine entered with Lysa in her arms, her movements gentle and fierce all at once, her aura glowing like a protective shield around the trembling clone whose breaths had turned thin and uneven. Lysa clung to Seraphine's shoulder, her golden eyes cloudy with pain, each breath cutting through her chest like a blade, the nebula's energy pushing her body faster than nature intended. Arlen rushed to her side, his heart twisting painfully as he placed his hand over hers. "I've got you,"